Hey everyone, this is Miss Moriarty and I'm here to discuss with us topic 9.9, which is all about endangered species. So, with 9.9, here we're going to talk a little bit about some topics that we have previously discussed, since we have touched upon endangereds in some previous units as well. So, why do species wind up becoming threatened or endangered or potentially extinct? Well, there can be a variety of ways that this can happen, right? Especially through maybe extensive hunting, poaching, habitat loss, which could limit their diet. They could be outcompeted by an invasive species, and so on. Now, not all species in an ecosystem that gets faced with adversity, such as any of those things, are going to wind up becoming extinct. It's the ones that are not going to be able to be fit enough to adapt to those ever-changing things in their environment are the ones that are going to most likely become either endangered, critically endangered, and maybe eventually extinct. Right, and that kind of goes back to some topics in bio, right, when we talk about evolution, right? If an individual is fit, then that means that they are able to not only survive, but as well as reproduce, right, and pass on their genes. So that is going to be an important piece to this topic of 9.9. So how do species wind up becoming threatened or extinct? Some of the major ways is through hunting and poaching. If we hunt, right, exotic species for their furs, for their tusks, horns, usually we do this in a manner in where we're going to over-harvest them, right? Those species are not going to be able to reproduce fast enough in order to replace what is now going to be lost. We can also see, instead of hunting and poaching, they can even be removed from their habitat and maybe even sold as an exotic type of pet. We know invasive species, right, back from 9.8, if they do wind up in a habitat, lots of those native species could be outcompeted, right, from those invasives. That could lead them to not being able to survive long enough and pass on their genes. Species that are very specialized in what they do, right? If they have a very narrow range of tolerance, like a niche specialist, then they're going to be more prone to endangerment than they say someone who might be more generalist. And then that brings into climate change, right? If we see patterns of temperature and precipitation change, that's going to force species to have to adapt, right, to now that ever-changing abiotic conditions. It might force them to migrate to a new habitat that maybe has a lot less resources for them, makes it a lot harder to live, and so on. So kind of going back to what I said before, right, remember, if you are a specialist type of species, you have a very narrow range of tolerance, right? Maybe you can only live, right, in a certain part of the tree, or you can only live in a certain part of the river due to temperature, or maybe dissolved oxygen. And so species such as these are very disadvantaged, right, by a ever-changing habitat versus a generalist who can most likely deal with those changes, right? They can live in a wide range of maybe temperature or maybe even pH. So they're less likely to become extinct or endangered. And this is something that they do like to ask about on the AP exam. So I would definitely know that specialist is more likely to be endangered versus a generalist is least likely. Now, going based off of our niche and our overlap that can take place when we see two niches overlap. Remember, we can have maybe resource partitioning, right, or maybe competitive exclusion. But remember, this kind of happens when we see interspecific competition. Right now, two separate species competing for the same resource. This can cause species, once again, to become threatened, especially if they're also faced with habitat fragmentation at the same time. As well as climate change. If we see more sea levels rise, and now that marine ecosystem has been flooded more frequently than it normally is, that's going to be just simply another factor that species is going to have to adapt to in order to survive, as well as now compete with other organisms. So what can we do to protect endangered species? Well, there are two pieces of legislation that we need to be familiar with that is associated with this topic, one of them being the Endangered Species Act. This was first passed in 1973. This then authorized the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to kind of determine if species are going to be vulnerable, threatened, endangered, extinct, and so on. It has also made the trading of these species illegal to do within the United States. Internationally, we now have the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, developed around the same year as our Endangered Species Act. It pretty much does the same exact thing, but this is now more on an international level, and about 175 countries or so have accepted this agreement today. Some other strategies besides enforcing more, say, laws, we could criminalize things like poaching and hunting in areas where we tend to see it be a more popular type thing. We could establish maybe wildlife preserves, wildlife corridors, ensuring that those animals' habitats are protected. Now, how do we establish all of this? This is actually through the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and they've established what's known as the Red List. So that's what you see on the left-hand side. It's actually a really good website. I recommend that you go and kind of like do some research on your own. But in the Red List category, you can see that they have, right, extinct, extinct in the wild, critically endangered, vulnerable, and so on. As of right now, there's about 42,108 threatened species that they've been able to establish, and they are continuing to assess populations of all different types of species all around the world in order to ensure that we can maintain biodiversity as best as we possibly can, since we know that a more biodiverse ecosystem is going to be more resilient to any type of change that we could see. So here's our practice FRQ on 9.9. If you want to take a moment, pause the video, you can answer it in your note packet and in the Edpuzzle. Okay, at this point we should have answered our practice FRQ, which first states that large terrestrial mammals are case strategists. Remember, these are types of mammals that don't produce as many offspring, have lots of parental care. You got to identify one of those characteristics and explain how it makes them prone to extinction. And the next one, you got to identify and discuss at least one conservation strategy that could be implemented. So what could we have said? Remember, case strategists, unlike our strategists, have few offspring, very low reproductive rates, makes it very difficult for them to be able to survive a changing environment and pass on their genes. They also tend to have very long gestational periods, long maturation periods, meaning that they don't tend to have offspring until later on in their life cycle, which can make it difficult for them to recover from any type of population decline, which makes them a lot more prone to extinction. B could have said a couple different things, having maybe better enforcement of laws, protecting habitats, less poaching. We could actually educate the public on maybe the ecological values of having these animals, which means we may receive more increased public support. Maybe we could establish the expansion and preserves of parks that can create a safe habitat for each of those organisms to reproduce and hopefully reduce the amount of poaching happening in the wild. Alright everyone, that is it for our video on 9.9. If you have any questions about the material covered, please leave a question.